Shabbat shalom. Well, every rabbi has their favorite parsha. I have to admit, Parshat Lech Lecha isn't my favorite, but it's one that I connect with very much. The words that begin this parsha, Lech Lecha, they're usually translated as something like, go for yourself. We hear in this parsha, go for yourself from your native land, from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And these words are spoken by Hashem, by God, to Avram, who later becomes Abraham, in literally the first conversation they ever have with one another. Now, while initially this command might seem somewhat inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, these instructions to go will set Abraham and really the Jewish people down a path and a journey that some might say we're still on today. Now, a minute ago I mentioned that Lech Lecha isn't my favorite, but one that I connect with very much. And that's because I feel like my whole life is one big Lech Lecha moment. Now, many of you know that I'm a Jew by choice. I would argue that's a Lech Lecha moment. But that's not the moment I want to speak about this morning. What I'd really like to do is talk about my journey, my physical journey from the land of my father, which is the great state of Texas, to a land that I did not know called California. Now, in order for any good story to be effective, the person telling it has to really know their audience. And I have told this part of my story before to non-Texans, but they really didn't understand the issue. They didn't get it. I think a lot of you understand this, that if you grow up in Texas, there's kind of an underlying expectation, especially from your parents, that you'll never leave and you'll stay in Texas forever. Now, I grew up in the very center of the state, so there was miles and miles of Texas all around me. I didn't leave the state until I was 13. And this might sound weird to say. I don't think people in my hometown ever really left. Growing up, you would hear parents talk about other people's children leaving Bell County, and they spoke about them as if they had moved to like Indonesia or something. They would never see them again. They'd say, oh, Johnny's gone forever. And I'd be thinking like, you need to calm down. Johnny just moved to Pflugerville. That's like 40 minutes away. Never see him again. In college, when I moved out of my parents' house, I just moved to Austin. That was a big, big deal. My parents were very, very concerned, even though I was about an hour down I-35. This really upset them. So years later, I became Jewish. It was time to explore rabbinical schools, and I knew that leaving Texas would be really hard on them. Actually, when I was first deciding on becoming a rabbi, I was still just a high school English teacher, and I was looking at schools, really thinking about the rabbinate, and I told Genevieve, who was my then fiance, I said, I think I want to go to rabbinical school. And she immediately said, Jonathan, that's great, I'll support you, you'll make a great rabbi, but I will not move to New York. So we ended up going to Los Angeles. Now, the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in LA admitted me into their program, but they told me in the interview, they said, Jonathan, your language skills, your Hebrew, your Aramaic, they need a lot of work. I said, well, I didn't start learning till I was 24. So before I could even begin rabbinical school, they said I would have to do an Ulpan Hebrew intensive over the summer in Los Angeles before I could even start school in the fall. So that final week of high school in May, where I was teaching, we said goodbye to all of our Texas friends and family, many of whom didn't understand what we were doing. They thought we had lost our minds. They didn't know what rabbinical school was. They said, "You're leaving Texas for what? What's rabbinical school? You're going to be a rapper?" They didn't get it. And I remember we drove down to Harker Heights to say goodbye to my parents, and it was a very emotional thing. And I remember as we pulled out of the driveway, my dad was just shaking his head and my mom was crying. And she had given us these new cups for our apartment that had a Texas flag on them. And I said, "Why did you give us this?" And she said, "So you won't forget Texas." Like I would just, what is that? I felt so sad. I felt like I had betrayed my whole family and my whole identity as a Texan. I remember when I moved to California, they cut up my Texas driver's license. They might have just as well taken out my heart and cut it in half. Oh! I knew somehow this was all part of God's plan, and that in order to be a blessing to the Jewish people, I had to go for myself from the land of my father to the place that God would show me. And so on the last day of public school as a high school teacher, all of my students wished me luck. They were devastated I wasn't coming back to school the next year. And when the bell rang, I turned in my keys, I said goodbyes, and I got in my little Toyota Corolla, which was packed full of stuff, and I just drove and drove. I just drove on I-10 all the way out to West Texas, through cities I had only ever heard about but had never ventured through. Sonora, Ozona, Fort Stockton. And I kept going further and further. And as I drove, I remember I watched my final Texas sunset somewhere around Van Horn, Texas. Don't go to Van Horn, Texas. And I checked into the cheapest, grossest Motel 6 ever because I was impoverished. And I sat on the bed alone, completely estranged from everything I knew. And I just broke down, started crying. And I knew this was going to be my last night in Texas for a long time. And when you have those moments, you think to yourself, what am I doing? Where was I going? Am I making a huge mistake? But something deep down in my neshama kept telling me that I just had to keep going, and I had to go for myself. So the next day, I woke up inspired, and I drove to Phoenix, Arizona, and the day after that, I finally arrived in LA. Now, I'd like to tell you that once I got to Los Angeles, it was smooth sailing. But on the first day of summer classes, I was trying to get a meeting with Rabbi Hodson, the dean of the school, and I was talking to his secretary, and she asked me some question, and I responded the way my mama told me to respond, with, "Yes, ma'am." And when I did that, she did not like that. She kind of got crazy. She chewed me out. She said, "Excuse me, ma'am is not my name. My name is so-and-so. You are not in Texas anymore, young man." Then she said, I'll never forget this. She says, "This is California." And when she said that, I realized, like Avram, I was in a land that I truly did not know. Things only got worse. The classes I were in were really challenging for someone who grew up without access to Hebrew. I was getting pummeled, and my classmates, many of whom, they grew up going to Camp Ramah, doing plays in Hebrew. Their father, their grandfather was a rabbi. They were doing great. And after a month, I was barely passing anything, and I had just about had it. So finally, I got that meeting. I got by his secretary. I got that meeting with Rabbi Hodson, and I told him, I said, look, I just can't do it anymore. I cannot continue to break my teeth over this unfamiliar language. I can't continue this embarrassment. I can't reconcile always being the dumbest person in the room. I couldn't do it. I wanted out. I told him, I said, I want to go back home. I wanted to go back to decent queso. I said, I want to go back to people who don't freak out when I say ma'am. Maybe I wasn't cut out to be a rabbi. I said, maybe I'm just supposed to be an English teacher. He said, maybe that's okay. And when I told him this, he looked at me. This is why Lech Lecha is not my favorite. This is why. He looked at me, he said, Jonathan, you can't quit. He said, he told me this. He said, I heard your Hebrew's really bad. He said, you don't have the language skills your peers do. Everyone knows that. He said, but you can learn that. He said, but the Torah you have, they'll never have. And you need to share that Torah with the Jewish people. And then he said a line from our Parshat. I don't know if he meant to say this. Thank you. He said a line from our Parshat. I don't know if he meant to say this. He said, and you will be a blessing. And I walked out of his office, and right then and there, I made a declaration to myself. I said, I will only move back to Texas when I have a pulpit of my own. Not as an assistant, because who knows how long that will be. I'll stay there, then I'll have to maybe move. I'm only going back once I have that senior pulpit. And for 3 years, guys, I busted my tuchus in rabbinical school. It was really horrible. I had verb charts everywhere. I studied, learned, and argued and prepped, and I was almost always the last person in my class academically. Went on like that for a while until I took a class called Chumash with Rashi in my third year, taught by my teacher, Rabbi Aaron Alexander. Aaron Alexander is a brilliant, very bright guy. Didn't speak a lot and rarely gave compliments. But I remember we started that class by learning Parshat Lech Lecha. And every week, each student in the class had to write a mini sermon over a comment that Rashi made in Lech Lecha. And after a couple months of doing this, I received a brief email from Rabbi Alexander. I kept it and printed it out. This is all it says. Kid you not. It says, Jonathan, your sermons are so good, ... there is hope for you yet. Wow. Well, I don't know if that was a compliment or... When I read those simple words, there is hope for you yet, it felt kind of like a divine echo. It was if God was whispering to me, just as God whispered to Abraham all those centuries ago, Lech Lecha, go for yourself. Because really, my friends, that's what Lech Lecha means. It's not just go from your land. It's go toward yourself. Go to the person you are meant to become. The truth is that kind of growth never happens when we stay comfortable. It doesn't happen when we cling to the familiar. It can only happen when we pack our car say goodbye to the people and the places that we love, and head in toward the unknown, trusting that somewhere along the way we'll find a blessing. So maybe that's the message of Lech Lecha for us today. Each of us, in our own way, is called to leave home, maybe not physically, maybe not across some desert highway, but to leave home spiritually, emotionally, personally. We are called to step beyond what feels safe to us, God's invitation to grow into who we are meant to be. And yes, it's hard, it's disorienting. Sometimes we cry in the motel room in Van Horn, Texas. But when we keep going, when we trust that there is something sacred waiting for us on the other side of our fear, we discover what Avraham Avinu discovered, that when we have the courage to leave home, we don't lose ourselves. Rather, we find ourselves. And in doing so, we become a blessing. So friends, if this morning you feel lost or you don't know which direction to go, trust Hashem's divine guidance and trust yourself. After all, you live in a state where you can still say ma'am. Shabbat shalom.